Good evening and welcome to Chatbox with Sam. Tonight's guest is Stephen J. Rubin. He's a film historian, documentarian, writer and producer, and he also has his own podcast now. And the backdrop you see behind him is of a book he's actually wrote, the James Bond movie encyclopedia and the Twilight Zone encyclopedia. And you can find Stephen J. Rubin on Facebook and IMDb. He does have credits on there. So welcome to Chatbox with Sam, Steve. Thank you for joining me tonight.
An absolute pleasure, Sam. I have a special affinity for people from Britain. I just think they're so special. Just the way you talk just sends me.
Oh, thank you. I wish people would tell me that when I'm on the phone. Because they can't understand me.
They say that the great George Bernard Shaw, that famous quote that America and Great Britain are a common country divided by their language.
That's funny. Yeah, I like his quotes. And Mark Twain's, I like his quotes too. If you were to encourage the younger generation, what would be your main focus?
Very good question. I think that as creatives, if you're a writer or a musician or you want to make movies, I think you have to practice your craft every day. Mm-hmm. There's no taking a break, especially in the early days, because there are thousands and thousands of people who want to do the exact same thing you want to do. And many of them are working 24/7 to achieve their goals. So one of the things I learned early on in my life is that this obviously applies to writing, which is my specialty, is you just have to write every day. You really do. There's so many things I could say. I've learned a bunch of things over the years, but I think as creative people, we also have to be business people. It's not enough just to write or record music or write poems or make movies. You've got to be an astute business person. That means you've got to learn how to write good business letters. You've got to learn how to take meetings and to listen and listen more. The reading the room. A lot of psychological things happen when you expose your creativity to the professional world. And I think that it's important to understand a lot of this. I think sometimes as creatives, we work in our little ivory towers and we forget about the world because we need to. But when we come back to the world, we've got to deal with people. And I think it's important to learn how to deal with people and to deal with them responsibly and to treat everyone by the golden rule, treat them the way you would want to be treated.
Absolutely. That's 100% my mantra, one of them. Yes. A lot of people do forget how to do that, unfortunately. Especially when they're in a moment, emotional moment. They forget at them times. And we all need to remember that, including me, being human and all.
Sure.
Just 90% of the time. Sometimes I'm part alien.
No one expects you to be perfect all the time. We live in a very imperfect world.
We do.
But I think that the trouble I've got into in the past is not listening. And as I've learned over the years, being a good listener is quite a plus, I'll tell you.
I agree. I've had to learn that too. You've had many topics to work with. You're a writer, you've wrote 2 books, and you've worked with many people in the industry. What inspired you into this career in the first place?
Well, I point to my mother and father as being great film fans. I grew up in a movie family. I was an only child, so invariably they would take me to the movies. In addition to the fact that from the ages of 5 to 10, I lived across the street from a movie theater. So I was at the movies 2-3 times a week, right, particularly on Saturday mornings where they would have 2 features. And this is during the period when science fiction, fantasy, and horror films were being figured prominently in the young people's world. They called them kiddie matinees. And so I love movies growing up. I never
Yeah.
thought about it as a career, but I watched a lot of movies. And then when I went to college as a history major, I started to write for my college paper. I went to UCLA,
Hmm.
and it was a very heady time to be a journalist because it was during Watergate.
Right.
And I kind of practiced my interviewing skills. And then when I got out of college, I decided that I would write a book. And they usually say, write about something you're passionate about.
Hmm.
And of all things, I decided to write about war movies, movies that
Oh.
I'd seen as a young person, from the classics all the way through Patton in 1970. My first book was called Combat Films, American Realism, 1945 to 1970. And it was kind of like my film school. I went around interviewing the great filmmakers who made the great war pictures. And it was fascinating. It's funny, the first person I ever interviewed, I just looked up in the Beverly Hills phone directory for the writer of a movie called Halls of Montezuma with Richard Widmark. And he was listed. And it turned out his name was Michael Blankfort. And he was originally a blacklisted writer
Right.
during that whole period when the writers were being accused of communist subversion. So I sat down with him, and then he introduced me to the gentleman who wrote Patton,
Right.
who introduced me to the person who wrote Battleground, who introduced me to the one who wrote 36 Hours. And I did this for about 2 years. And but I learned an interesting lesson. The book turned out fine, but it only sold 400 copies.
Oh.
So I said to myself, if I continue at this pace, I will be completely broke within 6 months. So not to say that I was only focusing my efforts on writing. I had a day job. I was a telephone operator at a hospital.
Oh.
So I was practicing my communication skills. But I said to myself, I got to write it on a topic that more people are interested in, 420 people.
Hmm.
So I approached Albert R. Broccoli, the producer of the James Bond movies,
Hmm.
and I said, I want to write a behind the scenes history, figuring that Bond had a little more life in it. This was
Right.
in 1977.
Hmm.
They'd done about 10 films by then. Um, that book came out in 1981 and sold 50,000 copies.
Oh,
So that was much
fantastic.
better. That
Yes.
was much better. And it restored my faith in the ability to make a little money. I never relied completely on writing because it's very hard to get a systematic income
Hmm.
from writing, but it opened some doors to me. And then I had to make a living. Being a telephone operator wasn't going to do it because I wanted something more associated with the film business. So I fell into publicity work.
Yes, I was just looking down, and you were a unit. If you'd like to explain what a unit publicist was back then, I know you played in film. You were involved with films like Silent Night and My Suicide. You was executive producer on My Suicide in 2009, and during Silent Night 2002. Bleacher Burn 2001, and the coolest guy movie ever, Return to the Scene of the Great Escape 2018.
It's my publicity career actually began shortly after I returned from my research trip to London to do the research on the Bond films, because Albert Broccoli actually introduced me to his stepson, Michael G. Wilson,
Oh.
and they opened their filing cabinets to me, and I got all of the key information on the Bonds. But I came back and I answered an ad in the Hollywood Reporter. In those days, they had two daily trade papers in Hollywood, the Hollywood Reporter and Daily Variety, and they would do classified ads. And one day, they had an ad saying that a major studio needs a science fiction convention expert. And I know you mentioned you're going to be going down to Comic-Con in a few days. I was going to science fiction conventions at that time because I was writing for a magazine in Chicago called Cine Fantastique, which was a magazine devoted to fantasy, science fiction, and horror films. And I was their resident expert on the 1950s. I was writing cover stories on movies like War of the Worlds,
Oh, wow.
Forbidden Planet,
Hmm.
The Day the Earth Stood Still. So they hired me, and because of I had done the convention circuit. By the way, my editor didn't pay me. I wrote these very long historical pieces, and the way he paid me was he gave me magazines to sell. So I would go to the convention and sell this kind of avant-garde film magazine and make the money from that, which was very little. but it got me at least to the conventions, and I knew the circuit. So United Artists hired me in 1978 to go on the road to promote the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers with Donald
Yes.
Sutherland and Leonard Nimoy. So that was the beginning. I didn't realize I was in public relations. I actually thought I was
Yes.
just being a convention guy, but the technical term for me was advance man, to promote the film on the circuit. And what had happened was George Lucas, the previous year with Star Wars, had hired the previous year before that a gentleman to do the exact same thing. And Phil Kaufman, the director of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, was very friendly with George Lucas. And it was Lucas who recommended that he send someone on the circuit, which was me. So I actually owe my whole career to Star Wars, because that got me my first job. And I did that for a year. And then I went into an agency, worked in a PR agency for a year, then started my own agency. And then a friend of mine became head of publicity for MGM and hired me to be a unit publicist. Actually, the first thing she did, Bo Derek had made a Tarzan movie with Miles O'Keefe, and they had fired their PR person in Sri Lanka for some reason. I have no idea why. So they came back to the States without a press kit. You know what a press kit is. It's biographies and background information on the making of the movie. Okay. So they hired me to compile that. And then I guess they were confident enough in me and my writing that they gave me a unit publicity assignment. And as I was telling you earlier, unit publicists actually work on the crew. They are the primary PR liaison.
Oh.
A film shooting is like a castle. You just don't walk on the set and say, howdy do. There's all this going on, and it's protected by security, and there's all these protocols that you have to adhere to. If you want to interview an actor on the set, whether you're a journalist or a TV reporter, you go through the unit publicist. So that was my job. And they sent me up to Wyoming for 3 months to work on a thriller called Endangered Species with Robert Urich and Jo Beth Williams. Interesting thriller. And that's how I got my baptism of fire. And the following year, I did the sequel to Porky's.
I remember that film. That was a big hit in England.
Yes, well, it was the original Porky's.
Very cheeky.
Very cheeky, right? Literally and figuratively. It was the first comedy to ever make $100 million at the box office. So I was assigned to the sequel, and they sent me down to Florida in the summer of '82. That was quite a fun experience for me. It's so funny, you go to these film sets and you've got a great story because a movie is shooting, and journalists like to be in on the making of the movie and interview the actors as they're making it. And I get down to Florida with all of this enthusiasm, and I was informed that because of the sensitive nature of the screenplay, that they were going to close the set to all press. So I'm saying, what? Because Porky's 2 would be a big story because of the success of Porky's 1. Well, it turns out that there's a little side plot in Porky's 2 about the Ku Klux Klan. And because I'm in the South and there's certain sensitivities about the Klan, they didn't want it to get out that we were working on a story with any references to the Klan, even though it's very minor in the movie.
Right.
But what happened was, since they took away all my PR duties, because I can't invite press to the set, I got to know the actors who were playing the boys. The nickname for the boys of Porky's was the Dirty Half Dozen. And basically every night they would play poker. And when I walked into the trailer one night, they were playing with matchsticks. So next day I went to the drugstore and I bought them some chips. And they said, Steve, why don't you play poker with us? And for 3 months during the summer of '82, all I did was play poker with the boys of Porky's. And it was very fun. I wrote some really terrific stories about them. I got to know them very well. And it was fun because it was an opportunity to really interact with the actors who sometimes can be a little bit more into their craft and don't really want to hang with the publicist. Well, I hung with the Porky Boys all summer.
That's awesome. That was awesome. What a great experience, though. So it was funner, you have to admit.
Oh yeah. And so that got me starting as a unit. And for the next 10 years, I did a lot of movies. I did Pretty in Pink. I did Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone. I did The Taking of Beverly Hills. I found out that the head of Showtime was a big baseball fan. So I pitched him on the great play. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It ran in LA and one theater for 11 years. And Bleacher Bums is all about the fans who follow the Chicago Cubs baseball team, which never wins. Of course, that changed a few years ago. They finally won.
They did win. John Cusack would call you different on that one.
No, absolutely. And I was celebrating that. I was celebrating that. But in those days, when they conceived the play, they were the lovable losers. So I sold it to Showtime, and we shot it up in Toronto in 2001 with Peter Riegert and Wayne Knight from Seinfeld, Brad Garrett from Everybody Loves Raymond, Charles Durning from Tootsie. We had a very good cast.
I remember that, Tootsie. Yes, that was a good film. My mom liked that very much. You had a good cast, and then you were executive producer on My Suicide in 2009. Can you share a little bit about that?
This is one of the most important projects I ever worked on. My friend David Miller came with me, and we've been writing together ever since. He wrote a story that was originally going to be a documentary about teen suicide being an epidemic in the United States. And we eventually turned what was a documentary into a narrative story about a young high school student who announces in his video class that he's going to film his own suicide as his class project. So you can understand the furor that was started by this. He goes through all these emotional tests and goes through evaluations, and we follow Archie on his journey. And this movie was so powerful to teenagers that we received letters from teenagers who were on the brink of committing suicide, and the movie has brought them back. And it's a movie that is so hopeful and takes you on a very intimate journey, but mostly so through the teenager's eyes. You really get into his head, and the first 30 to 40 minutes of the movie are very frenetic. It's kind of like MTV editing style. Then the movie settles down, but we've had such warm reaction of the movie. It's been a fan of Ted Sarandos, who runs Netflix, and he's renewed it every year for the last 10 years. So it's currently on Netflix. It's called My Suicide. It was originally titled Archie's Final Project, and it was released in 2009. We won Best Picture at the Berlin Film Festival in our class, and 19 other Best Picture awards. So this was a very honored motion picture. It's called My Suicide.
Yes, I was very drawn to that because it's, the topic is a very sensitive but real one.
Very real one. Sometimes you have to try something a little different to get your story across. One of the first things we did was we visited with Edwin Schneidman. When you win a prize in suicide prevention, you win the Edwin Schneidman Prize. He was the father of suicide prevention. He told us that our idea was the most exciting idea he had seen in years. So that really encouraged us. And we were able to get some major backers. Danielle Steele.
I used to read a lot of her books.
Right.
Yes.
Well, she supported our movie through her foundation because she lost a son to suicide. And we got some great support on that. David Miller, the filmmaker, got a lot of honors. We write together. We've actually written a children's picture book that is currently available through Amazon. It's called The Cat Who Lived with Anne Frank. And it's a story.
Yes,
it's
the girl that was the Jewish girl that was hiding.
The Jewish girl in the attic in Amsterdam, who was in hiding. There really was a cat in the attic. She writes about him several times. His name was Mushi. And we decided to tell a story of the attic, but from the cat's point of view, because we said one day, you have these people living in this, in this attic. They never go outside. They tiptoe during the day. They don't want to alert the factory men. And we thought, what did the cat think of all this? And what has happened, the book was very, very popular. And we've written an animated feature which we're outselling right now. We've actually sold it, but the company that bought it the first time went out of business. But the idea is the book really tells Anne's story from the cat's point of view. Our story takes Mushi out of the attic into the streets of Amsterdam, where he joins the Dutch animal resistance against the Nazis. So basically, it's a metaphor for what really happened. And it's a way of teaching young people a little bit about that period in history. You know, there are a lot of people out there who claim that the Holocaust didn't exist.
Adolf Hitler was warned, Winston Churchill warned him, if you invade Poland, there will be a war, and then he did. He'd already terrorized the actual people that lived in Germany. They terrorized their own people too, because my friend's mother lived in Germany. It wasn't just the Jewish that got terrorized, it's anyone that they came into contact with that conflicted with them. So she was a young girl, and she stuck my friend's mother, she's died now, she stuck her tongue out to a German soldier. She was 5 years of age, and she was sent away from her parents.
Oh my God.
6 years she didn't see her parents for.
Oh my God. That's
their own. She says, people think we didn't suffer, but we did, within our own country. So the German people suffered too.
Well, you know, you hear stories of college students in America giving the Nazis salute at parties, thinking it's cool. And I think we have to counteract that, because there's nothing cool about the Nazis.
No.
And, you know, all these white supremacist organizations who use Nazi regalia to attack various groups need to learn who the Nazis really were. Listen, if I was in a room with a white supremacist, I would say to them, listen, you've got a right to your own beliefs, but just stop using the Nazis as your inspiration, because they're the worst people in the history of the planet.
Right. Well, it was mass genocide, but there was one thing that was more mass genocide than that, and that was the Native Americans.
Oh yeah, we are not guiltless. We did horrible things here.
In history, if you look back, they say that's the most unrecorded mass genocide in history. One of them.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Just
and
saying,
then of course,
because I love history too.
Oh yeah, and then of course slavery. You know,
Yes.
long before more civilized countries had given up the practice of slavery, including England, we still had slaves, which is unconscionable. I think that all the history books have to be rewritten to reflect what we are coming from, and hopefully, we've learned our lessons. But in many cases, we know we haven't.
Maybe not rewritten, but added to, like an updated version, because obviously when they were wrote, it was fresh in their minds. But when you speak to someone 10 or 20 or even 30, 40 years later, the effects of what happened at that time, at that moment, it shows you it wasn't just then in that moment, it had long-term effects. First World War had long-term effects, poverty, and Second World War had long-term effects. Every war has long-term effects and devastation on the innocent people. It takes over, always.
Right.
It's never just one thing.
Very true. Was your family involved in World War II? Were your grandparents involved?
No, but they they were Irish. They liked a good fight down the pub on a Friday night. Very joking. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about regarding the films that you've been involved with? Is anyone that's influenced you that you had great admiration and respect for, per se?
Well, I have to say that the last 6 or 7 years, I've been focusing completely on comedy writing. I feel that we really need to learn how to laugh again. I think the comedy movies of late have been kind of woeful. I also think that the family audience is not being served properly. So my writing partner, Billy Reback, Billy was one of the original writer-producers on the Tim Allen series Home Improvement, and he's written for a lot of shows on the Disney Channel. And he and I teamed up, and we've been focusing on writing comedy, which I think is a good thing to get out there. Tough to sell, but we're determined to make an imprint as comedy writers.
That sounds awesome. Laughter holds memories like music. And if you can make someone laugh, they'll always remember. Always. So,
Right? Laughter is very therapeutic. Also, it just takes your whole body, it rises up out of the trough, and you feel good.
absolutely, 100%.
My job is to keep you smiling.
Aww. Well, you have so far. I've really enjoyed the conversation so far. Well, how has music influenced your life?
That's a very good question as well. I love music. I think that growing up in the 60s, how could you not be exposed to the great music? I mean, I bought my first car in 1969. I bought a brand new Mustang,
Ooh.
and I turned on the radio. I never really listened to the radio much. I was 18, and the Who came on, Pinball Wizard,
Oh,
and I became a big rock and roll fan. I just the rock and roll world. And over the years, I love music. I particularly like film music. The composers who compose soundtracks, and some of my favorite music comes from movies, not just the composition, but even some of the songs. Big fans of The Devil Wears Prada with Meryl Streep and Anne Hathaway.
mm-hmm.
And we love the music from that movie, and I play it frequently in the car. Um, the classic Saturday Night Fever, Thriller, obviously. I remember being a big fan of Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson, and his magic flute, and also classical music. I'm very fond of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, which is featured strongly in that great movie, The King's Speech, which came out a few years ago with Colin Firth, and it plays strongly in that. So music is very much a part of my life. I love music.
Yeah, I like how.
And by the way, we've written our first musical.
Have you?
Which is called, yes, Comic-Con the Musical.
Really?
And it's an adorable story. It's about 6 people who come to Comic-Con to find romance, success, adventure, geekdom, and it's what happens to them at Comic-Con. And we have initially have 4 songs composed, and we're out there trying to sell this right now.
I'd love to see that because I love comic.
Oh yeah, I think you'd have fun with it. It's definitely a fun piece.
Absolutely.
Definitely. This goes back to me and those first science fiction conventions promoting Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I went all over the United States to all these conventions. I went to San Diego Comic-Con in 1978, and there were 500 people there. Wow. I mean, today they get 150,000 people.
Yeah. Well, all the charities you could choose from, which one would you choose to advocate for, and why?
It's a very good question. I think paralyzed veterans, I think that's one of the ones I donate to frequently. I donate a lot to veterans, and I donate a lot to animal charities because I think they're 2 areas that need support. But with the veterans, paralyzed veterans of the United States, I do support them. I think that our veterans not only can be in physical pain, but they have the great emotional pain of being combat veterans. And that I've learned a great deal about PTSD and, all of the trauma that returning soldiers go through. And I think that they never should be ignored. We should always not only respect them, but give them anything they need to get along. And I think they don't get enough respect.
I 100% agree with you, sir. 100%. And it's a shame that it takes charities, and they could have given their life, and there's no price on that.
Right. Whenever there's kind of a rule of thumb, whenever you see a veteran, you should go up to them and thank them for what they do, because I think they appreciate those moments, But I think that Many of these veterans live in a very dark place. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, when you survive the great trauma of, here I am, from a young age writing about war movies, make believe Hollywood war movies where nobody gets killed. In reality, the combat veterans who actually go into combat see horrific things
Mm.
that they find very difficult to get through. And I think that in the real world, we need to really understand where they come from. It's interesting, Sam. One of my favorite movies of all time. I've done two documentaries on it. Is called The Great Escape.
Mm.
Steve McQueen, James Garner, Richard Attenborough. It's all about a prisoner of war escape. You know the movie.
Yes.
It was released in 1963. It was about this escape from a German prisoner of war camp. And a lot of the escapees were murdered by the Nazis. They were basically shot in the head by the side of the road. And I saw this movie and I love this movie. It's very, very well known because of Steve McQueen's motorcycle chase in the movie, which is very iconic, made him a big international star. Well, to do my documentary, I went back to Poland and I took a camera crew into Poland. It was originally Germany, but at the end of World War II, that land became Polish land. And I found a little cemetery. It was as kind of a tribute. And there on these concrete slabs were the names of all these officers who were murdered by the Nazis. And I'm sitting there in this little enclosure. I don't think anybody in America had ever visited it. And I featured in my documentary, and I'm looking at these names, and these aren't the movie names. These are the actual names of the officers who were killed. And it just brought home to me that this was a real story. These were real victims, and it was very emotional.
Yeah. It was. And all conflict is, and it continues on, unfortunately.
Right.
If we're honest about it, you know.
No, of course.
Thank you for
Of
sharing
course.
that, though. I hope people look up your books
Thank
and,
you.
and read, because you have some very interesting thoughts. And I know when you write and you put onto paper that is, you're only telling us a little bit of your thoughts, but you can go into depth with books.
The James Bond movie encyclopedia, the Twilight Zone encyclopedia, The Cat Who Lived with Anne Frank, they're all there.
Thank you. How do you feel about what's transpired since COVID-19?
Well, it's had a dramatic effect on everyone. I think that I'm very troubled, and I won't get into a big political discussion because that's really not what this is about, but I just feel that people have stopped talking to one another. And I think that if you have a difference of opinion with someone, you still should be able to listen to their point of view. You can disagree with it and explain why. But I find a lot of people don't want to talk at all. They do not want to hear your opinion. And there are people who believe there are conspiracies that I don't think really exist. As much as a writer and researcher that I love the internet because you obviously have everything in the world at your fingertips, it's also unfortunately given power to people who do not deserve power. People who have theories that they keep to themselves, that we should listen to people who are more, I hear all the time from people who have no medical education whatsoever why they don't want to do something and they're not listening to their doctors. And I think that's ridiculous. I mean, it's beyond ridiculous. And also these poor doctors who every day try to save lives have even been threatened lately because they won't prescribe things they feel are detrimental to their patients. And I think that's awful. I think that, getting back to just normal everyday, how are you dealing with stuff? I feel that we need to, what did I say earlier about listening? We need to listen to people and we should give them the opportunity to say what they say. And they should respect us. We should respect them. And I think that's kind of gone out the window in our country in many cases. I think it's fomented by a lot of responsibility amongst television news networks. I think a lot
Media.
of the media is responsible for a lot of that. When I was growing up, we had a commentator on Channel 2 called Walter Cronkite. He was one of the great commentators. You know, he read the news, and he was widely respected. We need a Walter Cronkite today because I think that a lot of the TV journalists or the news commentators should kind of put a sock in their mouth and not comment on the news anymore. Just tell the real news as opposed to offering their
Fake
opinions. And this
news.
applies to both sides of the equation. I really think that, and we know now that a lot of news is driven by ratings. The reason that they have that phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. The first story on the late news is usually a murder, and draws people in like people are drawn to traffic accidents. And I think
Mm.
that it's very theatrical in the way news is presented. So I think it's a little crazy, but Samantha, I'm a glass half full person. I really believe that things are going to get better. I can't think otherwise. And people like you and I who can have a good time and tell stories and share
Mm.
information, that's the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always say, we're familiar yet uniquely different. And if we just accept people's differences and that's the way they are, or their opinion, without cutting them down, we're all allowed to have the freedom. If you base your country on freedom, well, give someone the freedom to have their own opinion. And if and the reason why we got a divide is because politics took over the science. They should have just left it to the scientists, let them talk, leave it to them, and maybe there wouldn't have been such a divide as there is right now. But that's my take. Anyway, and I think, yes, always be kind. Be kind to people. There's no need, because we're only here for a short time on this earth. So kindness matters.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I 100% agree with you.
Is there anything that no one has asked you in an interview that you would have liked them to ask you?
Wow, is that a good question?
And you're on full
Um,
Zoom.
that I think that I always ask the question to my friends: if you were taken to a desert island and you were only allowed to bring one film with you to play for the rest of your life, what would you play? And I ask that question. People don't ask me that question, and I get to say that my favorite movie was the movie I just referenced, The Great Escape. I've seen it probably 100 times, and I'll probably see it 100 more times, but I never get tired of it. That's one of them.
But
So let me
thank you
ask you
for.
that question.
You can ask me the
So
question.
let me ask you the question. You're all of a sudden taken to a desert island, and you have your little video machine, but you only take one movie with you. Which one are you going to bring with you?
Oh my goodness. I love so many. If I was going to be stuck on my own on a desert island, I'd have to go with comedy.
Yes, yes, I hear you.
So I'd go with something like Step Brothers. Because couldn't I take four? I would love. I love.
Which you
Okay,
laughed and I didn't hear the title. Which one did you say? Step Brothers?
Step Brothers with Will Ferrell. Yeah, I'd have to have all the grown-ups, with Adam Sandler.
Do you
But
like the films do you like the films of Richard Curtis? Did you like Four Weddings and a Funeral with
oh
Hugh
gosh,
Grant? Was that
yes, yes, I love that
yes.
film.
Yeah,
And
he also did that movie Love Actually, the Christmas
yes,
movie. You probably like that one too.
I did like that one,
Okay.
and I do. My favorite is actually sci-fi.
Oh,
I love
okay. So
sci-fi.
are you Star Wars or Star Trek?
Both of them.
Oh,
I can't choose between them two. They're both great artists, actors in there, and they're both very well done. And the Star Trek I watched from a child, and William Shatner, I've watched him as I was growing up. I saw his face on my screen many times. I think my mum had a crush on him. So, who didn't back then, Hello, William.
By the way, he made two classic episodes of The Twilight Zone. I don't know if you know them. One is called The Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. You must have seen. It's where he's sitting on an airplane and he looks out the window and there's a creature tearing up the engine. I don't know if you ever saw that one.
And no one else could see it. Only him. Is that the one?
Only him. And
Only him could
they
see
remade it. Right. And they remade it in the feature movie, the Twilight Zone movie. His role was taken by the great character actor John Lithgow. And they did the same story. George Miller, who did all the Road Warrior movies in Australia, directed that segment. It was quite effective. But Shatner also did an episode of The Twilight Zone where he and his wife go into a diner and they see one of these little fortune-telling machines. And it gets creepier and creepier and creepier as they find out what their fortune is. I recommend that one as well.
But you know who else was funny? 9 to 5. I love that. Dolly Parton.
Oh, very much so. Working 9 to 5.
Right away to Italy. I'm going to cut that bit out.
There you go. There you go.
I'm now blushing. I do something goofy and then I blush about it. I've just gone 110 degrees.
I actually worked on a movie with William Friedkin, who directed The Exorcist. Mm-hmm. And we did a remake of the great courtroom classic 12 Angry Men. And Billy was very funny. He didn't know any names, so he called everybody Mo. So he'd look over at a guy doing the gripping. He'd say, "Hey Mo, get over here."
I love that guy. Hook me up. I think he's awesome. It's perfect. Is there any last words that you'd like to say to the audience or the viewers?
Well, I would like to tell everybody about my podcast. It's called Steve Rubin's Saturday Night at the Movies. It's currently available on Spotify, and I hope we're moving to some other distribution channels soon. But we interview people involved with classic movies. Last week we had the author he's the world's leading expert on Tarzan and the movies, which is fun. This week we're talking to one of the actors who worked at Universal during the 1950s. His name is William Reynolds. He was in a classic Twilight Zone episode. He also was on the FBI for many years. The following week we're going to talk to Billy Gray, who played the little boy in The Day the Earth Stood Still. I'm really having a lot of fun talking about classic, cult, and current movies. And then I have a Facebook page called Steve Rubin Saturday Night at the Movies. I have a page on the James Bond Movie Encyclopedia. I have a page on the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia. I'm also available on LinkedIn and Instagram.
Thank you so much, Stephen J. Rubin, for joining me on Chatbox with Sam.
Well, thank you, Sam. You've been a lot of fun, and I hope we can stay in touch because you have such great energy and charisma.
Oh, thank you. And likewise, and we definitely will do that. I keep in touch with most of the people I've interviewed. They might find I'm annoying. Thank you very much, everyone.